November 1941, Western Desert, Egypt. The sun beat down like a hammer on an anvil, turning the inside of British tanks into steel ovens that could cook a man alive. Sergeant Samuel Thompson wiped the sweat from his dark skin and watched another Crusader tank explode in the distance, the third one in 10 minutes. Black smoke climbed into the pale sky like a funeral banner. Inside that burning metal coffin were 3 men he'd shared tea with that morning. Now, they were gone. This was the reality of fighting Rommel's Afrika Korps in North Africa, and the British were losing badly. The numbers told a grim story. In just the first week of Operation Crusader, over 300 British tanks had been destroyed or damaged beyond repair. That meant 300 crews either dead, burned, or wounded so badly they'd never fight again. Tank crews were dying at rates between 60% and 70% in the opening attacks. For every 10 men who climbed into a tank at dawn, only 3 or 4 would be alive by sunset. The German panzer divisions were destroying British armor at a ratio of 3 to 1. For every German tank knocked out, 3 British tanks burned. The mathematical reality was simple and terrible. At this rate, Britain would run out of tanks and trained crews long before Germany did. The problem wasn't the tanks themselves, though the British Crusader had its flaws. The problem was how they were being used. British commanders believed in the old cavalry tradition of the direct charge. They sent their tanks forward in broad daylight, racing across open desert toward the enemy in straight lines. It was brave, it was bold, it was also suicide. The German 88mm anti-tank guns could punch through British armor from over a mile away. The German gunners would sit calmly behind their weapons, watching British tanks charge toward them like knights in a medieval tournament, and pick them off one by one. The British tanks never got close enough to fire back effectively. British officers in their command tents studied maps and argued about tactics, but they refused to change their approach. When junior officers brought reports from the battlefield suggesting that German tactics, rather than German technology, were winning the war, the senior commanders dismissed these concerns. "We've always fought this way," they said. "British armor attacks with speed and courage. That's how we won at Cambrai in the Great War." But this wasn't 1917, and Rommel wasn't a static trench line. The old methods were failing dramatically, and hundreds of men were paying the price. Into this disaster walked Sergeant Samuel Thompson and his unusual tank crew. Thompson had been born in Jamaica in 1915 and came to England in 1938 looking for work. He'd studied mining engineering back home and understood rock, earth, and elevation better than most men. When war broke out in 1939, he volunteered for the British Army. They didn't quite know what to do with him. A black man from the colonies wanting to fight for the Empire, the recruiting officer had raised an eyebrow but took his papers. Thompson was smart, capable, and determined. He ended up in the Royal Tank Regiment. His crew was just as unusual. His gunner was from West Africa, his loader from Trinidad, his driver a working-class white British lad from Manchester, and his radio operator from Barbados. They'd been assigned to an experimental unit, though nobody called it that officially. The truth was simpler and uglier. The army had put all the men who didn't quite fit into regular units together and hoped they'd do well enough not to embarrass anyone. Some officers called them a publicity experiment. Others said less kind things when they thought no one was listening. Nobody expected much from them. Nobody thought they'd survive long enough to matter. The elite tank regiments didn't want Thompson or his crew. When he'd tried to transfer to more prestigious units, he'd been politely refused. "We have our standards," one colonel had said, not quite meeting Thompson's eyes. So, Thompson and his crew were assigned to a Crusader tank and sent to the desert with low expectations and even lower support. If they died, few would mourn. If they survived, it would be a pleasant surprise. This was the harsh reality of being different in an army that valued tradition above almost everything else. But Thompson had something the army's elite didn't expect. He paid attention. While other sergeants focused on keeping their tanks polished and their guns clean, Thompson studied the battlefield itself. He walked the desert at dawn and dusk, feeling the land under his boots. He examined every destroyed British tank he could find, looking at the angle of the holes punched through their armor. He noticed something that seemed obvious once you saw it. Every single destroyed tank had been hit while moving forward, advancing toward the enemy. The holes were always in the front or sides, never in the top or bottom. The German 88mm guns were devastating weapons, but they had a limitation. They couldn't aim downward very well. The barrel could only depress so far before it hit the gun's own mounting. Thompson started thinking about mines back in Jamaica, about how you dug down into the earth for protection, how elevation and angles mattered when you were working underground. He began to wonder, what if British tanks stopped charging forward like cavalry and instead used the desert's natural features for cover? The desert wasn't flat like it looked from a distance. It was cut through with wadis, dried-up riverbeds that created natural trenches and gullies. What if a tank could hide in those low places and only expose itself to shoot? He brought his ideas to his company commander, a captain who'd been in North Africa for 6 months and had the tired, haunted look of someone who'd seen too many friends die. Thompson explained his theory about gun depression angles and hull-down positions. He suggested that tanks could use wadis as natural protection, firing from concealment rather than charging in the open. The captain listened politely, then shook his head. "That's defensive thinking, Sergeant," he said. "We're not here to hide. We're here to attack. British armor doesn't cower in ditches like frightened rabbits. We advance with courage." Other officers were less polite. One major called Thompson's suggestions cowardice wrapped in clever words. Another said it was un-British to hide from the enemy. The prevailing wisdom was clear. Real soldiers attacked directly, and anyone who suggested otherwise didn't understand proper warfare. But Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. The evidence was there in every burned-out tank, in every crew that never came home. Something had to change, or they'd all die following tactics that didn't work. He just needed a chance to prove it. Thompson spent his evenings doing something most tank sergeants never bothered with: mathematics. He sat in the sand beside his Crusader tank with a notebook and pencil, working out angles and distances by the light of a small oil lamp. The German 88mm gun was a fearsome weapon, but physics didn't care about reputation. Every gun had limits. Thompson calculated that the 88 couldn't depress below 3 degrees. That meant if a target was low enough relative to the gun's position, the barrel simply couldn't point down far enough to hit it. He measured his Crusader tank carefully. From the ground to the top of the turret was exactly 8 feet and 2 inches. If he could find a position where only the turret showed above the landscape, he'd need just 4.5 feet of vertical cover to be safe from those deadly German guns. The wadis scattered across the western desert provided between 6 and 8 feet of natural protection. The numbers worked. A tank sitting in a wadi could be nearly invisible while still able to shoot back. But numbers on paper meant nothing without proof. In early December 1941, Thompson made a decision that could have gotten him court-martialed. Without official permission, he took his crew out on a night reconnaissance mission. They left camp after midnight when most of the army was asleep, driving their Crusader slowly across the desert with only the stars for light. Thompson had his driver move carefully through the darkness, searching for wadis that had the right characteristics. They needed to be deep enough for protection, but positioned where a tank could still see potential enemy approaches. They needed escape routes in case things went wrong. Over 3 nights, Thompson and his crew mapped 47 different wadi positions across a 5-mile stretch of desert. For each position, Thompson recorded the exact depth, the firing lanes available, and the fastest routes in and out. His loader, a young man named Marcus from Trinidad, thought Thompson was crazy. "Sarge, if the Germans don't kill us, our own officers will when they find out what we're doing," Marcus whispered one night. Thompson just smiled in the darkness. "They can't court-martial us if we're right," he said. The next step was practice. During the day, when they were supposed to be doing routine maintenance, Thompson drilled his crew on rapid positioning. They practiced driving into a wadi, stopping precisely so the hull was hidden, but the gun could still aim, firing at imaginary targets, then reversing out and moving to a new position. At first, it took them almost 5 minutes to complete the sequence. That was far too slow. German tanks could move and return fire in that time. Thompson pushed his crew harder. They practiced the same movements dozens of times, until everyone knew their role without thinking. The driver learned exactly how far to reverse. The gunner practiced acquiring targets quickly from a hull-down position. The loader developed a rhythm for feeding shells into the gun. After 2 weeks of secret practice, they could move from concealment to firing position and back to cover in 90 seconds. Thompson timed it with his pocket watch. 90 seconds. That was fast enough to matter. But someone had noticed their unauthorized activities. Thompson's battalion commander, a lieutenant colonel with a thick mustache and thicker opinions, called him into the command tent one morning. The colonel's face was red with anger. "Sergeant Thompson, I've had reports that you and your crew have been conducting unauthorized night operations and engaging in defensive drill completely contrary to established doctrine. This looks very much like cowardice dressed up as tactics. I could have you court-martialed for this insubordination." Thompson stood at attention, saying nothing, knowing that anything he said would only make things worse. The colonel continued, his voice rising. "British armor attacks, Sergeant. We don't hide in holes waiting for the enemy. That's not how this army fights. That's not how gentlemen fight." Thompson's career might have ended right there, but someone else had been watching too. Captain Peter Morrison was a young intelligence officer, barely 24 years old, who joined the unit 2 months earlier. Morrison had studied German at Cambridge before the war and spent his days translating captured German documents and tactical manuals. He'd read Thompson's reports about gun depression angles and defensive positioning. More importantly, he'd read the German training manuals for anti-tank gun crews. The Germans actually taught their gunners to worry about targets in defilade positions, targets using terrain for cover. The German manuals confirmed everything Thompson had figured out on his own. Morrison burst into the colonel's tent just as Thompson was being dismissed. "Sir, I need to speak with you about Sergeant Thompson's tactical analysis," Morrison said, slightly out of breath. The colonel looked annoyed at the interruption, but Morrison outranked Thompson, so he had to listen. Morrison spread German tactical documents across the colonel's desk and explained what he'd found. The Germans knew their 88s had limitations. Their own manuals warned gunners about hull-down enemy positions. The tactics Thompson had developed weren't cowardice. They were exactly what the Germans feared most. Morrison argued passionately that Thompson should be given a chance to prove his methods in actual combat. The colonel listened, his expression slowly changing from anger to reluctant interest. Finally, he made a decision. "One engagement," he said, pointing a finger at Thompson. "You'll get one proving engagement. If this works, we'll talk. If it fails, or if you get your crew killed with these hide-and-seek tactics, I'll make sure everyone knows whose idea it was." It wasn't permission exactly, but it was enough. The opportunity came on December 18th, 1941, near a small crossroads called Bir el Gubi. British reconnaissance reported a German column moving north, trying to flank a British infantry position. 9 Panzer tanks, a mix of Mark IIIs and Mark IVs, were advancing through an area Thompson had mapped. He knew every wadi, every fold in the ground. He convinced 3 other tank commanders, all young sergeants like himself who were tired of watching their friends die, to join him. Together, 4 British Crusader tanks moved into position in a network of wadis that afternoon. They waited, engines off, in complete silence. Thompson's crew could hear their own breathing inside the tank. The metal walls ticked and pinged as they cooled in the late afternoon air. Through his periscope, Thompson watched the horizon. The German tanks appeared just before sunset, dark shapes moving against the golden light. They were advancing in a standard formation, confident and unhurried. They had no idea 4 British tanks were hidden less than half a mile away. Thompson waited, counting the German tanks, calculating distances. His gunner had the main gun trained on the lead panzer. Thompson's mouth was dry. Everything came down to this moment. If this worked, he could save lives. If it failed, he'd be responsible for 3 other crews dying with him. Range 1,200 yards. Thompson whispered into the radio to the other tanks. "Wait for my command. We fire, we move, we survive." His hand gripped the edge of his seat. The lead German panzer rolled closer. 1,100 yards, 1,000 yards, fire, Thompson said quietly. 4 British guns fired almost simultaneously. The sound was enormous in the desert silence. The lead German panzer jerked to a stop, smoke pouring from its engine. 2 other German tanks were hit in the first volley. Before the German crews could react, Thompson's driver had already shifted into reverse. The Crusader pulled back down into the wadi, invisible again. The German return fire screamed over their heads, hitting nothing but sand and air. Thompson's crew moved to a second firing position 400 yards away, using a route they'd practiced a dozen times. They emerged from a different wadi 90 seconds later. The Germans were still searching for where the first shots had come from. Thompson's gunner found another target, 800 yards. The shell hit a Panzer III in the side armor. It brewed up immediately, flames shooting from the turret. The Germans were panicking now, spinning their turrets, trying to find an enemy they couldn't see. The engagement lasted 20 minutes. When it was over, 6 German tanks were burning or disabled. 3 had retreated in confusion. Thompson's 4 British tanks hadn't taken a single hit, not one. The German column commander sent a radio message back to his headquarters that was intercepted by British signals intelligence. The message said they'd been engaged by invisible British guns, firing from positions that couldn't be located. The Germans thought they'd encountered some new British weapon or tactic they'd never seen before. They were right about the tactic part. Thompson and his crew sat in their tank after the battle, hands shaking from adrenaline, hardly believing they'd survived. Marcus, the loader, started laughing, almost hysterical with relief. "Sarge, we're alive. We're actually alive." Thompson allowed himself a small smile. They'd proven it worked. Now the question was whether anyone would listen. News of the engagement at Bir el Gubi spread through the British tank units faster than dust in a desert wind. 4 tanks against 9, 6 enemy destroyed, 0 friendly losses. Those numbers made people pay attention. The battalion commander who'd threatened to court-martial Thompson suddenly wanted to hear every detail of the battle. Other tank sergeants started asking Thompson questions about wadis and hull-down positions. Young officers who'd ignored him before now studied his hand-drawn maps. The change was dramatic and swift. Before the battle, British tank units in North Africa were averaging 65% losses in every major engagement. That meant nearly 2 out of every 3 tanks that went into battle never came back. But the units that started using Thompson's terrain tactics saw their losses drop to between 15 and 20%. The difference was staggering. Crews that learned to use wadis and covered positions were 3 times more likely to survive a battle. More importantly, they were killing German tanks at rates the British Army hadn't seen since arriving in North Africa. Thompson's own crew became living proof of the method's effectiveness. Over the next 8 months, from December 1941 through July 1942, his Crusader tank was credited with 23 confirmed enemy kills. 23 German tanks destroyed by a crew that was supposed to be a publicity experiment, by men the establishment had written off as second-rate soldiers. Even more remarkable, Thompson's crew never lost a single tank to enemy fire during those 8 months. They went through 2 Crusaders, but only because they wore out the engines and transmissions from constant use, not because the Germans knocked them out. Other crews that adopted the same tactics saw similar results. The mathematics of survival had changed completely. By February 1942, the British 7th Armoured Division, the famous Desert Rats, began training all their tank commanders in the new tactics. Thompson became an unofficial instructor, though he still held the rank of sergeant. Over 400 tank commanders attended courses where Thompson explained terrain exploitation, gun depression angles, and rapid repositioning. He used diagrams drawn in the sand and brought officers out to actual wadis to show them firing positions. Some of the older officers looked uncomfortable taking lessons from a black sergeant from Jamaica, but they couldn't argue with the results. Dead crews learned nothing. Living crews could fight again tomorrow. The British Army's tank kill ratio against the Afrika Korps improved from 1 British kill for every 3 German kills to nearly even 1-to-1. The Germans were no longer hunting British tanks with impunity. Now it was a fair fight. But not everyone celebrated the change. Old Guard commanders, men who'd learned their tactics in the previous war, grumbled that this new approach was too defensive, too cautious. "It's not proper tank warfare," complained one brigadier who'd commanded cavalry before the war. "Tanks are meant to charge, to close with the enemy. All this hiding and shooting from cover, it's not gentlemanly." Some officers, particularly those from elite social backgrounds, refused to acknowledge that the lessons had come from a colonial sergeant. They gave credit to the intelligence officer Morrison, or claimed they'd been developing similar ideas themselves. One colonel told his men that these tactics were traditional British fieldcraft adapted to armor, completely ignoring where they'd actually originated. The resistance wasn't just about tactics. It was about who got to be right, who got to matter, who got to change how the army fought. The Germans noticed the shift in British tactics too. Rommel's intelligence officers compiled reports about British tanks fighting from covered positions, appearing and disappearing like ghosts. The Germans called it the Wadi problem in their military communications. Rommel himself issued new tactical guidance to his panzer commanders. German tanks were ordered to advance more slowly and with infantry support to clear wadis before the armor moved through. German anti-tank guns were positioned on higher ground whenever possible to improve their depression angles against hull-down targets. The Afrika Korps adapted because they had to. The easy victories of 1941 were over. British tank crews were learning to fight smart instead of just fighting brave. The cat-and-mouse game intensified during the battles along the Gazala line in May 1942. This was where Thompson's crew faced one of their closest calls, and where the brutal reality of desert tank warfare became most clear. Dawn broke over the desert on May 23rd, with temperatures already climbing past 90 degrees. By noon, it would be over 120. Inside a closed tank, the temperature could reach 130 degrees Fahrenheit. The metal walls became hot enough to burn skin on contact. The air was thick and hard to breathe, heavy with the smell of gun oil, sweat, and the acrid stink of cordite from previous battles. Thompson's crew sat in their positions, each man dripping sweat, waiting for the German advance that reconnaissance had reported. When the German tanks appeared, they came with infantry support, just as Rommel had ordered. This was new. This was dangerous. Thompson watched through his periscope as German soldiers in their grey-green uniforms moved ahead of the panzers, checking the wadis, looking for hidden British tanks. His position was about to be discovered. "Steady," Thompson said to his crew, his voice calm despite his racing heart. "We wait until they're close. Make every shot count." The metallic screech of German tank treads on rock grew louder. Thompson could hear the clank and rattle of their mechanical parts, the grinding of gears, the diesel rumble of their engines. Through the periscope, he saw a German officer pointing in his direction. They'd been spotted. "Fire!" Thompson ordered. His gunner squeezed the trigger. The 2-pound gun recoiled with bone-jarring force, the entire tank shaking from the blast. Choking cordite smoke filled the crew compartment instantly, making eyes water and lungs burn. Through the smoke and the periscope's narrow view, Thompson saw the German Panzer Mark IV lurch sideways, flames erupting from its turret ring. "Reverse now!" Thompson shouted. His driver shifted gears with practiced speed, and the Crusader pulled backward down into the wadi just as German return fire screamed over their position. Shells exploded where they'd been seconds before, throwing up fountains of sand and rock. The concussions were loud enough to make ears ring even inside the tank. Marcus, the loader, was already feeding another shell into the breach, his movements quick despite the cramped space and choking smoke. They moved to their alternate position, a wadi they'd scouted 3 days earlier, 900 yards to the east. The battle lasted 4 hours. It was a brutal, exhausting fight, where both sides used every trick they knew. German tanks tried to flank British positions. British tanks used the wadis like a network of tunnels, appearing in unexpected places, firing, then vanishing again. Artillery shells fell like metal rain, throwing up geysers of earth. The noise was constant and overwhelming, a symphony of destruction that made communication difficult even over the radio. By the time the Germans pulled back in the afternoon, Thompson's crew had claimed 2 more kills, but they'd also had closer calls than ever before. One German shell had hit the sandberm in front of their position, close enough that shrapnel pinged off their armor like deadly hail. Another shell had landed behind them, so close the blast wave rocked the entire tank. That night, sitting outside their tank and drinking tea that tasted like diesel and sand, Thompson's crew was quieter than usual. They'd survived, but barely. The Germans were learning, adapting their tactics to counter British hull-down fighting. Marcus looked at Thompson in the starlight and asked the question everyone was thinking. "Sarge, how long can we keep this up? They're getting smarter. It's getting harder." Thompson didn't have a good answer. He knew Marcus was right. The Germans weren't going to keep making the same mistakes forever. But the unexpected consequence of Thompson's tactical revolution was larger than any single battle. As word spread that a mixed-race crew led by a Jamaican sergeant was teaching the entire 7th Armored Division how to fight, other marginalized soldiers found hope. Colonial troops from India, Africa, and the Caribbean started receiving more respect from white British soldiers who'd previously dismissed them. Working-class tank crews realized that good ideas could come from anywhere, not just from officers with university educations. The rigid class and race barriers that defined the British Army started developing small cracks. It wasn't a social revolution, not by any stretch, but it was something. Men who might have died following bad tactics because they came from the right people were now alive because they'd listened to someone the establishment had initially rejected. By summer of 1942, hull-down tactics were standard practice throughout British armoured units in North Africa. What had started as one sergeant's unauthorized experiment was now official doctrine. Training manuals were being rewritten. New tank commanders arriving in theatre were taught terrain exploitation before they ever saw combat. The approach that old guard officers had called cowardice and un-British was now just called good tactics. Even the Americans, who were starting to arrive in North Africa with their own tank units, studied British desert tactics and incorporated the lessons into their own training. Thompson's innovation had spread beyond the British Army entirely. The Germans continued trying to counter these tactics, but the fundamental problem remained. Their guns couldn't shoot downward enough, and the desert provided too many natural hiding spots. German commanders wrote frustrated reports about British tanks that seemed to materialize out of nowhere, fire with deadly accuracy, then disappear before return fire could be effective. The Afrika Korps was still dangerous, still capable, but they'd lost their overwhelming advantage. The Desert War had become a fair fight, and in a fair fight, numbers and supply lines mattered more than tactical surprise. Britain had more tanks, more supplies, and more time. The tide was turning, and Thompson's crew had helped turn it. The techniques Thompson developed in the desperate winter of 1941 didn't disappear when the North African campaign ended. They evolved and spread like seeds carried on the wind to every theatre where tanks fought. When British armoured units moved into Italy in 1943, they brought their desert lessons with them. The Italian countryside with its hills, valleys and stone walls offered even better cover than desert wadis. Tank commanders who'd learned to fight hull down in North Africa found the rolling terrain of Italy perfect for their methods. They'd hide behind ridgelines, showing only their turrets, devastating German positions before fading back behind the hills. American tank crews arriving in Europe studied British tactical manuals that now included detailed sections on terrain exploitation and covered firing positions. The principles Thompson had figured out with pencil and paper in the Egyptian desert became standard practice from France to the Philippines. By 1943, every British tank commander was required to master position warfare before they were considered combat ready. The training courses Thompson had taught informally became official military curriculum. New officers at armor schools studied diagrams showing proper hull-down positions, correct use of terrain features, and rapid displacement techniques. The words hull down and defilade position became common military vocabulary. Young lieutenants, fresh from England, learned these tactics as if they'd always been part of British doctrine, never knowing they'd been considered cowardice just 2 years earlier. The institutional memory of the military shifted remarkably fast when survival was at stake. What the old guard had resisted in 1941 became the foundation of armor tactics by 1944. The American Army, building its armored forces rapidly during the war, absorbed these lessons eagerly. When the first American tank battalions arrived in North Africa in late 1942, British liaison officers taught them the hard-won secrets of desert tank fighting. American tank commanders learned to read terrain for tactical advantage, to use hills and gullies for protection, to shoot and move rather than sitting still. These lessons proved vital during the Allied invasion of Normandy. The hedgerow country of France, with its sunken roads and earthen walls, was perfect for hull-down tactics. American Sherman tank crews, often facing superior German Tigers and Panthers, survived by fighting smart. They used every fold in the ground, every stone wall, every hedgerow for cover. The fundamental principle Thompson had discovered remained true. A tank that couldn't be seen was a tank that couldn't be killed. After the war ended in 1945, military analysts studied the evolution of tank warfare during the conflict. They wrote reports and books analyzing what had worked and what hadn't. The shift from charging cavalry-style attacks to terrain-based positional fighting was noted as one of the key tactical developments of the war. But these official histories had a curious blind spot. They credited the evolution to field experience and tactical innovation by armor units. They mentioned the North African campaign as the crucible where these tactics were forged. But they rarely mentioned Thompson by name. The official story smoothed over the messy truth of who had actually figured it out first and why the army had initially resisted. It was easier to say that British armor evolved naturally through combat experience than to admit that a Jamaican sergeant had to fight his own commanders almost as hard as he fought the Germans. Thompson himself had an unusual trajectory after that first successful engagement at Bir el Gubi. As his tactics spread and his crew's kill count grew, it became harder for the army to ignore him. In 1943, something remarkable happened. Thompson was commissioned as an officer, receiving the rank of lieutenant. This was extremely rare for colonial soldiers, especially black soldiers from the Caribbean. The British Army of that era was deeply hierarchical and stratified by class and race. Officer ranks were generally reserved for men from the right families with the right education, but Thompson's record was undeniable. 23 confirmed kills, 0 losses, 400 tank commanders trained, tactics that had changed the course of the desert campaign. Even the most prejudiced colonel couldn't argue with those numbers. Thompson wore his officer's uniform with quiet pride, knowing what it represented, knowing how many doors had been closed before one finally opened. He survived the war, which itself was a minor miracle given the casualty rates among tank crews. When peace came in 1945, Thompson faced a choice. He could stay in Britain, where opportunities for black men were limited but at least existed, or he could return to Jamaica. He chose home. In 1946, Thompson sailed back to the Caribbean, back to the island where he'd learned mining, engineering, back to family and familiar streets. He didn't talk much about the war. Many veterans didn't. The things they'd seen, the fear they'd felt, the friends they'd lost, these weren't easy subjects for conversation. Thompson got a job with a mining company and lived a quiet life. He married, had children, worked hard, and kept his medals in a drawer where visitors wouldn't see them. He never received major official recognition during his lifetime. There were no public ceremonies honoring his contributions. No military college was named after him. No statue was raised in his memory. The British Army moved on to new challenges, new wars, new innovations. Thompson became a footnote in regimental histories, if he appeared at all. The official narrative of the North African campaign focused on famous generals like Montgomery and Rommel, on big battles like El Alamein, on dramatic turning points that could be marked on maps. The story of a sergeant who'd figured out how to use wadis didn't fit the grand narrative that historians preferred to tell. His crew members scattered to the winds after the war ended. Some stayed in Britain, finding work in the cities, building new lives far from the islands of their birth. Others returned to West Africa, to Trinidad, to Barbados. They wrote letters to each other for a few years, sharing news of families and jobs, remembering their time together with mixture of pride and relief that it was over. Eventually, as years passed and lives diverged, the letters became less frequent and then stopped altogether. The men who'd fought together, who'd trusted each other with their lives, became separated by distance and time. That was the way of war. Intense bonds formed under fire rarely survived the transition to peace. Modern tank warfare still relies on the principles Thompson discovered. Today's tank commanders, whether American, British, German, or Israeli, are taught to use terrain for protection. They learn about covered positions, about minimizing their exposure, about shoot and move tactics. The technology has changed dramatically. Modern tanks have laser rangefinders, thermal imaging, advanced armor, and guided munitions. But the fundamental tactical principle remains the same. Use the ground to your advantage. Don't present an easy target. Make the enemy work to find you. Military academies teach these concepts as timeless wisdom, part of the bedrock of armored warfare. Few instructors know that these tactics were once considered cowardice, that they were developed by a man the establishment wanted to ignore. The story of Thompson and his crew reveals uncomfortable truths about how institutions resist change, especially when that change comes from unexpected sources. The British Army in 1941 was losing badly in North Africa, hemorrhaging tanks and crews at unsustainable rates. The solution to their problem was figured out by a sergeant they'd assigned to an experimental unit because they didn't know what else to do with him. He presented his ideas to officers who dismissed them because they challenged tradition and because they came from someone who didn't look like them or sound like them. Only desperation and mounting casualties finally forced the institution to listen. This pattern repeats throughout history. Organizations wedded to tradition often can't see solutions, even when those solutions are standing right in front of them, especially if the person offering the solution doesn't match their expectations. War has a brutal way of cutting through prejudice. When bullets are flying and tanks are burning, survival cares nothing for skin color or social class or which school you attended. In the desert's harsh clarity, what mattered was whether an idea worked, whether a tactic kept men alive, whether a crew could fight effectively. Thompson and his mixed-race crew proved that excellence can come from anywhere, that innovation often emerges from the margins rather than the center, that the people written off as second-rate can teach the supposedly first-rate how to fight and win. But the lesson goes deeper than just military tactics. Thompson's story asks us to consider how many other innovations we've missed because we weren't listening to the right people. How many solutions to our problems exist in voices we've chosen to ignore. How much talent and brilliance gets wasted because institutions value conformity and tradition over effectiveness and truth. The establishment's assumptions didn't just slow down tactical improvement in North Africa. They actively got people killed. Men died following bad tactics because those tactics came from colonels and brigadiers, while good tactics were ignored because they came from a sergeant from Jamaica. Today, as modern militaries wrestle with questions of diversity and inclusion, Thompson's story offers a clear lesson. Diversity isn't just a moral good or a political goal. It's a tactical advantage. Different backgrounds and experiences produce different ways of thinking about problems. The mining engineer from Jamaica saw the desert battlefield differently than cavalry officers from English country estates. His difference wasn't a weakness to be overcome. It was a strength that saved hundreds of lives. Organizations that can recognize and utilize talent, regardless of where it comes from, will always outperform organizations that insist excellence can only come from traditional sources. The philosophical truth at the heart of this story is both simple and profound. Innovation, like courage, is colorblind. Good ideas don't care about the accent of the person speaking them or the color of the hand that writes them down. But people and institutions do care about these things, and that caring costs us dearly. How many other Thompsons have we overlooked? How many brilliant solutions have died unheard because we decided in advance who was worth listening to? These aren't just historical questions. They're present and urgent, as relevant now as they were in the Egyptian desert in 1941. Thompson's legacy isn't just about tank tactics. It's about staying humble enough to learn from anyone, brave enough to challenge tradition when tradition is failing, and wise enough to recognize that sometimes the person with the answer is the person you least expect.